Hello, everyone. Welcome. That is MC Hammer, an Oakland legend. That's my hometown hero right there. And we have to pray just to make it today. So well said. Okay. We are. This is our fourth session, and I want to be pushing us now, beginning to push us into the weeds. So far, we've been pretty big picture about all of this. We looked at the very definition of prayer, the very word itself, tefillah, which is our word for prayer, and we looked at the origins of our prayer tradition, and particularly where we got those three prayers that make up the kind of the daily Jewish prayer cycle. And as we thought about those things, we were thinking about like where does our prayer tradition come from at all? What was it meant to do? What are some of the core prayer traditions that we're drawing from? And then last week we took a little twist, a little turn when we looked at the Shema, which is a different thing. The Shema. Which we're going to talk about tonight, the famous prayer that begins, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one." But what we spent our time considering last week was whether the Shema really is a prayer at all, because it seems to be much more about the recitation of these particular words, and we have that obligation, which goes all the way back to the Torah. And then, meanwhile, we've been talking about this other thing, which is the tradition of replacing the daily sacrifices with prayers, and wondering if maybe those prayers go all the way back to the primal prayers of our ancestors. So we've got a lot of big core Jewish prayer images and ideas swirling around now, and I want to begin. I think now we have all the basic building blocks that we're going to need, but I want now to begin to use those blocks and to identify them, to start to see the structure of our prayer cycle, because that's what we're not just going to talk theology in this class, although we will talk theology. We'll talk theology more tonight. We'll never stop talking theology, because talking about prayer is talking about theology, because we're doing some kind of connecting to some kind of force. So we have to wonder, what is it we're trying to do? And so that will be a part of our conversation tonight. But I never want to get so lost in theology that we forget to do the work of really mapping out. Part of what we're trying to do is we're trying to understand like how to navigate our way through this book. And tonight, I mean, in some ways, we've started to do that. We've identified, there are three prayers a day, and in that session we said, and then on Shabbat there's another one, and then on Yom Kippur there's another one. So we've started to see structure beginning of the formation of a prayer structure. But tonight, I think what we're going to do is, hopefully by the end of this session, we'll have a kind of a basic skeleton, right? A basic architecture, just a basic form of the makeup of the three daily prayers. And once we understand that core makeup, then everything else that we learn will be a kind of an add-on. Think of it like a spine. What we're going to learn tonight is the spine, or maybe the skull and the spine, if I'm like really trying to use that analogy, because the two big pieces that we're going to be working with tonight, the two big pieces that we now have some reference points for, some access to, are the Shema, which we talked about last week, and the Amidah. The Amidah. Okay, so we'll remind ourselves of what those are in just a second. Let's say a blessing over our Torah study tonight. And just and center ourselves, get ready to immerse ourselves in words of Torah. Okay. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Okay, here is a source sheet for this evening. I see someone is asking about last week's session and whether we can post last week's session. I don't know if it's posted on the website, but Andrea, if you're there and you can post last week's session, it may be helpful to some folks. But here is this week's session, a little source sheet, and some of you like to click on it and have it at your ready. But as you know, I will mostly share it myself and put it on screen. So let's begin that now. And I want to just start by reminding us, here are some basic, really basic definitions of the material that we're going to be working with tonight. The two, I would say, primary units that can help us think about the structure of our prayers, and those primary units are the Shema and the Amidah, I just said. So let's just speak out what they are, because those are both foreign words, Hebrew words. And so let's just review. Some of us will be familiar, some of us will be aided by just speaking out that the Shema is the recitation of and this is just minimally, it would be one line. The most minimal definition of the Shema is the recitation of the words in Deuteronomy 6:4. I should say in words in Deuteronomy 6:4. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is, or the Eternal is our God. The Eternal is one. I usually translate it as the Eternal, but I'm so used to saying the Lord is our God. The Lord is one. Right? It's like it's such a famous phrase. The English is almost famous. Okay. And by tradition, the full Shema, which we're not going to work out completely tonight, but part of what we're talking about tonight is how these things get worked out. The full Shema consists of three full paragraphs from Deuteronomy 6, right? 6:4. Here, let's go back for a minute to last week's class. This is the first paragraph of the Shema, Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 4 through 9. And it begins, Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one. And then it goes on, Ve'ahavta. All right, so you'll have the first line there, and then the rest of that paragraph. And then there's another very similar paragraph in Deuteronomy 11. The rabbis decide that should be in the Shema as well. And then there's another paragraph which is related in a different way in Numbers chapter 15. And the rabbis decide, we should recite that as well. Now, part of what I'm hoping to do tonight, if nothing else, is to give you a sense of what does it mean to say the rabbis decide? I just said, there's this paragraph, and then the rabbis decided, let's put in another paragraph. And then the rabbis said, let's put in another paragraph. And you even see that I'm saying, one line, but maybe actually you should write the whole paragraph. So the rabbis, when I say the rabbis, I'm referring to the voices in the Talmud, the kind of the second great Jewish holy book, which is composed in the time between the 2nd and 6th centuries after the destruction of the temple, which is part of why the rabbis are the people who are so worried about how we're going to replace the offerings of the temple. And now, I got asked in the beginning of this class, and I get asked from time to time, what is a good book on Jewish prayer? What one book should I read on Jewish prayer? And the real answer to that question, the one book that you should read, and then you would totally understand Jewish prayer, there is an answer, and it is the first volume of the Talmud, of the Babylonian Talmud, Tractate Brachot, and meaning blessings. And it's the first volume, we're going to look a little bit at it tonight, is the volume where they really spend time discussing prayer. And what you're actually witnessing as you read through the Talmud is the rabbis trying to construct what over centuries will come to be what we now know as this, the Siddur. Okay, so and you can even see visually, this is a lot bigger than this, right? And this is pretty big, but it takes a lot of work to get to this, a lot of work. And so there is an answer to the question, what one book should I read? It's the first volume of the Talmud. The problem is The first volume of Talmud looks like this. And if you know anything about studying Talmud, it's not just that it looks like this, but every page takes hours and hours to read if you're doing it well, days and days to read if you're doing it very well. So I recommend to you all that you go through this volume. It is one of the great joys of Jewish learning, Talmud Masechet Brachot. But we're going to have to do a little shortcut, right? Because we don't have, what it really takes. We don't have a good solid year of daily study to get through this. So instead, we're going to try and condense that. But I do want to, I say all that to say, yeah, it's a whole encyclopedic volume of just conversation. What should we do in the morning? What should we do in the evening? Let's think about this. And we're going to do that tonight. But we're just going to see snippets, just snippets tonight. But part of what I want to, we have two goals. Let me just say it one last time. Two goals for the evening. One of our goals for the evening is to get to that basic core prayer structure made up of the Shema and the Amidah. And the other goal is to see how the kind of meandering conversation the rabbis are having leaves us with a kind of a volume of snippets, little like asides or differences of opinion or sayings that become authoritative and that become the very source for the construction of our prayers. Okay, so let's now turn back to let's now just turn back for a second to our definitions. We hadn't even gotten through them, and see that the Shema then is, when we talk about the Shema, we're talking about the obligation to recite these words, and eventually, liturgically, we're referring to 3 paragraphs. Now, 3 paragraphs that come from the Torah. When we talk about the Amidah, the word Amidah means standing. So it is a reference to the standing silent prayer, which, okay, I'm going to take this very slowly. The standing silent prayer, that may be familiar to some of you just from going to shul. There is a moment in every single one of our prayers, in every single one of our daily prayers, morning, afternoon, evening, but also the additional prayer for Shabbat and holidays, and also the additional prayer for Yom Kippur. There is one moment, in any prayer where you will find everybody get quiet and stand, and sometimes people will rock, and sometimes they'll just stand still, but that standing is the Amidah, the standing. And 2 important things to say about the Amidah up front. The rabbis referred to the Amidah, to this prayer that we're going to consider tonight, as tefillah. In other words, prayer. So when you look in the Talmud, every time they say, and then you say tefillah, what they mean is you say your Amidah. You say your standing prayer. Okay? So the standing prayer is going to become, in some ways, the core of every single one of the prayers. Everything else that we will see will be built around that Amidah. Next time we meet, and I should say right away, we're not meeting next week. Next week you have Hanukkah off. We're going to meet in 2 weeks. So in case I forget to say that at the end, we're not meeting next week, meeting in 2 weeks. Every prayer is going to be structured and built around the Amidah. Okay? So Shachrit has an Amidah, the morning prayer has an Amidah, Mincha, the afternoon prayer, has an Amidah, and the Mariv, the evening prayer, has an Amidah. Okay, so those are the units that we're going to be playing with today. And as I said, by the end of class, we'll have a sense of how they go together. But for now, the thing to know is that the most important pieces of our daily prayer life are the Shema and the Amidah. And once you have some sense of what those are and where they go, then you begin to have a sense of the basic structure of the daily prayers. Okay, let me pause. I've been talking for a while for questions. I see one from Florine.
There's a little conflict here with the previous class. The previous class, we talked about the spoken word with the power of the breath coming through us and going outward. Now all of a sudden it's silent.
Okay, great. That's good. Florine is reminding us that the Shema felt very different than the Amidah. When we looked at the idea of the Shema, it seemed like an entirely different institution. And part of the point of the Shema was saying it out loud, reciting these words out loud. Whereas the Amidah, and we came up with this along the way too, when we looked at Hannah and her prayer, Hannah, her prayer in the temple, it was she mouthed the words, but they were silent. So that's great. So Florine notices, oh, wait, some of these prayers are spoken out loud, some are spoken silently, right? So what Hannah becomes the basis for is the Amidah, is that quiet, but not entirely in your mind. One of the laws of that prayer is that you actually do mouth the words. But that's different. That's a different prayer modality than the Shema, which you don't just mouth the words, you say Shema, you say it out loud. Okay? So part of what Florine is already asking us to do is to think about, well, okay, now they're both part of the prayer. Last week we asked, is the Shema even a prayer? But this week we're going to see how the Shema and the Amidah will both appear in our prayers. So what's the difference between those two prayer modes? What are we doing in those? And what would it mean to see them come together, as we will eventually do? Okay, another question from Jenny Davidson Goldbrun.
Yeah, I think Florine just took some of what I was going to say, and it's revealing the one class that I didn't attend, which was last week. But is it significant that this core prayer is silent? What does that mean to us as Jews? That what I heard you say is that silence as a form of prayer is the crux of our prayer life.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that's the right question. I don't have like a ready answer, and I don't think there is a ready answer. But if the Shema and the Amidah are the two big prayers, it's really the Amidah that is the core prayer. It's really the Amidah that is the prayer. As you can see, the rabbis are referring to the Amidah as prayer, right? It's not even clear whether the Shema is a prayer, and yet, so on one level, the Amidah is really the center, in which case we can ask questions like, oh, so I guess really the heart of our prayer is that moment of silence, when we turn inside, when we really are like in a kind of meditation. The Shema is more like a declaration. It's not like a. On the other hand, the real dilemma we have here is that the Shema is in the Torah. It's mandated by the tradition itself, whereas the Amidah, this core prayer, is we probably are already getting a sense it's sort of made up, isn't it? Didn't they just make that up? Like the idea that there's a silent prayer that you say in 3 times a day. Where did they come up with that? Well, they tried to connect it to the sacrifices. They tried to connect it to the ancestors, but it wasn't so clear. And let Maimonides make the point more clearly than I can. Maimonides reminds us, and this is part of what we are trying to work our way through today. The number of prayers does not, this is Maimonides, it says Mishnah Torah. This is his most famous work, the Mishnah Torah. Maybe not most famous in the world. In the world knows him for the Guide to the Perplexed. But in Jewish circles, his legal book, the Mishnah Torah, is his most famous work. And it's because he does a great job of summarizing the discussion in the Talmud. And what he reminds us of here is that ein minyan hatfilot min haTorah. The number of prayers does not come from the Torah. Does not come from the Torah. And the standard liturgy is not derived from the Torah. And there's no fixed time for prayer in the Torah. Okay? That no fixed time for prayer in the Torah. Maimonides couldn't say it any plainer. There's the whole institution of Jewish prayer in some ways seems concocted, seems like a replacement, seems like something the rabbis are coming up with. Maimonides says it clear. It's not in the Torah. It's not like there's this. The Shema is in the Torah. So you see what kind of confusion we've got going on here now. Like the Amidah is really the core of our prayer, but there's also the Shema, which isn't really a prayer, though it is in the Torah, whereas the Amidah, like how these two then come together to form like as I said, the sort of the skull and the spine of Jewish prayer, we will get to. Okay, one last question, then we'll move forward from Susan or Marvin.
It's me, Marvin. And Shema, the word Shema is an imperative. It says, "Hear, O Israel." You're reaching out to your other co-religionists to hear, whereas Tefillah, the Amidah, we're asking for things, and they're two different bundles of wax.
Great. Okay, great. And Marvin's doing some of the important kind of secondary work that we will hopefully get to at the end, which is thinking about, okay, what is the Shema? Forget about how you say it and how authoritative it is. What is the core? What is the thrust of the Shema? What is it doing as a prayer or as a recitation, whatever it is? And what is the Amidah doing? And Marvin begins to give us some sense, which is the Shema is a declaration of something. Listen to this. The Amidah is full of requests. Please, I entreat you, to use a word that we started with. I entreat you, God, please do this. I am asking for something. Very different prayer modalities. Shema, declaring. Amidah, begging, requesting, right? So that already, there's something very different about those modes. What does it mean to put them in dialogue with one another? Okay, so without further ado, let's begin to dig in now a little bit into the Talmud. Let's look into the Talmud. And it is, I guess I just want to say this, it is not a code of law, the Talmud. It is a discussion of law. And eventually people like Maimonides will turn it into a code. But part of what I'm going to ask us to do tonight is just sort of like pay attention to the conversation, and hopefully by the end you'll be able to go back and say, oh, I see where that idea came from in the rambling conversation that rambles along without an indication, oh, we're now making an official decision, we're now making it. It'll take centuries of rabbinic extraction from the Talmud to get to the official decision. Okay, but let's begin where the Talmud begins. Let's begin literally where the Talmud begins. And I indicated this at the end of last week's class. It turns out that not only is the first volume of the Talmud all about prayer, so that gives you a sense of the rabbi's priorities, but the very first sentence of the Talmud, the very first rabbinic words that there are, so to speak, are about the Shema. The recitation of the Shema. That's the first thing they start with, okay? So we're going to start with the Shema. We'll try to figure out a little bit like the Shema and what the rabbis imagine should be happening in the Shema, or when we should be saying the Shema. And then eventually we'll see the Amidah come up as well. Now, let me just start by asking you, somewhat rhetorically here, because we talked about this last time, and I think a lot of you will know this right away, but does the Shema have fixed times of prayer? All right. The Amidah, Rambam clearly, Maimonides clearly said, does not have any fixed times. Does the Shema have fixed times? Yes. Everybody's nodding yes. Someone venture to tell me what they are? I want to unmute and tell me, what are the fixed times? Susan, can I call on you? Susan came in.
When you wake up and when you go to bed.
When you wake up and when you go to bed. Okay. That's right. Morning and evening. And where does that come from, Susan?
It's in the prayer itself.
It's in the Shema itself. It's in the Shema itself. Although, importantly, it's in the opposite order than the one that Susan just named for us. Okay. And that's one of the important things that we're going to be looking at tonight. So we've got some source material, but I just want to say, and this is just last sort of transition into the Talmud here. It's true. Susan's 100% right and will be right by the end of the class. Like this turns out to be the case. That is the source when you lie down and when you rise. But let me just state perhaps, let me just state something that is perhaps not obvious, which is that the phrase here that you shall teach in these words, which I command you today, shall be on your heart. You shall teach them to your children, and you shall speak them when you stay at home and when you walk on the way, when you lie down and when you rise. There it is. That's Susan's phrase. Uv'shachvecha uv'kumecha. These two words. When you lie down and when you rise. Now, let me just say, it isn't that great. It says that in the Torah. It's not 100% clear to me from that paragraph that I now need to recite these words in the morning and the evening. And that's my obligation. Well, what about walking on the way? And what about teaching them my children? What about all those other obligations? It's not like that I immediately intuited the prayer structure that I'm now obligated to in the Shema. So we've got that source material, but part of what the rabbis are doing is exactly what is making those moves that Susan now knows, is taking those phrases and making some rules out of them. And the rabbis were into rules, and as we'll soon see them talking about why and how they were into rules. But let's now take a look at the Talmud itself. The Talmud is made up of two parts: the Mishnah, the earlier teaching, and then the Gemara, the later teaching. So we're going to start with the Mishnah, the first Mishnah. Okay, so let's go in. This is the very first rabbinic words. This is like, like this is like in the beginning. It resonates in the Talmud the way in the beginning does in the Torah. Okay, so this is where the discussion begins. Okay, from when does one recite the Shema prayer in the evening? That's the first question that the Talmud asks. When in the evening do you recite the Shema prayer? And not just when, but from when? Starting when? Starting when can I recite my evening Shema? Now, I want to point out some things right away, which is, one, there's clear, like this is where they start. So there's some kind of like they're talking to an audience that knows what the Shema is, and it seems like they're already referencing some tradition. Right? Like the question presumes that there is an evening Shema that needs to be recited. We kind of know that. When does it start? So sort of like we're coming into the middle of a discussion. Okay. All right. Let's keep going here. So when do we start? Well, from the time the priests returned to their houses, they worked in the temple, they returned home in order to eat from their tithe, right? Everybody contributed to the priestly tithe so that the priests had something to eat because they didn't work in the fields, they worked in the temple. So whenever the priests go home from work, like like work day is over, they're heading home. At that time, that's when the obligation to recite the Shema, the evening Shema, begins. And you can do it until the end of the first watch. Now, what is the watch? Well, there were different times when there would be there's some debate over what this means, but let's just say there were priests who were overseeing the temple at night, and they would have different assigned duties at the temple, and the first watch would be the first third of the night. So the first answer, when do you recite the Shema? First, like this conversation is about when that evening obligation to recite the Shema it begins and ends. And the first answer is, well, it begins when the priests used to come home about that time, the end of the day, and you can do it for the first third of the night, let's say. But then there's a disagreement, and another opinion holds that it's until the end of the first watch is one rabbi's opinion. But the majority opinion, the rabbis say until midnight, half the night, not a third of the night. You can recite the Shema half the night. And then finally, Rabban Gamliel, who was the most authoritative rabbi of the day, says, no, you can do this all the way until the dawn comes up. Okay? 3 opinions there. Everybody seems to agree your obligation to recite your evening Shema begins when the priests came home from their duties. Now, I want to point out something. We're not going to actually analyze this text as deeply as we might if we were just starting to learn the Talmud. And then we would think about everything that the Talmud is doing and what it means, and we'd scrutinize every word. For our purposes, we're going to move more quickly. We just want to see this discussion get launched. But let me just point out a couple of very important things. One is that you see the rabbis linking prayer. We've already looked at this. They're doing it again. They're linking whatever will be our prayer life. They're linking it to the ancient traditions of the temple. Okay? Just like we learned that the rabbis tried to match the prayers with the offerings in the temple. So now they're trying to match the Shema with the timing of the end of the day in the temple. So the temple is very much in their mind, right? Clearly, the Shema in the Torah didn't say when you lie down as soon as the priests get home from their duties at the temple, right? That's a rabbinic move, trying to track it with that business in the temple. And the other obvious sort of thing that I want to state here is that there is a disagreement, and that's the way the Talmud works. There's three opinions here. Can you recite the Shema for the first third of the night? Can you recite it for the first half of the night? Or can you recite it all night? Okay. Now, that's the opening. That's the opening gambit of the Talmud. Soon we're going to jump into the Talmud itself and start to, like, as I said, map out. Okay, so when Shema in the evening, when Shema in the morning. But let's just read the rest of the Mishnah here, this opening teaching of the Talmud, because part of what we see here in this Mishnah is some of the reasoning for the very discussion at all of when do you begin and when do you end, and when do we have to do it? The very idea that there are rules around prayer. Because note that we have just made a major move from the Rambam's admission, the Maimonides' admission that there is no fixed time for prayer. And now what are we talking about? Fixed times. Now, you might say, wait, fixed time for the Shema. Fixed time for the Shema. But remember, that wasn't obvious from the Torah either. But here are the rabbis trying to come up with all of these fixed times. And they offer us right up front an interesting reason for the very structure that they are beginning to work out. And this is the reason that they offer. So this is such a great move here. Now, remember, these are the first lines of the Talmud. We have a little debate up here. And then the very next thing that happens is that they tell a story. And this gives you a sense of what the Talmud is like. It's not just a code of law, as I said. It's a set of teachings that can easily meander into a parable, a lesson, a legend that the rabbis tell about God, or a story that they tell about each other. And here's the story that they tell about the reciting of the Shema in order to prove the point. So here's the story. Once it happened that Rabban Gamliel, this is the last opinion, Rabban Gamliel says until the dawn comes up. Once it happened that Rabban Gamliel and his sons came home late from the alehouse. Okay? His sons were out drinking. It's amazing. It's always an amazing thing to me that the Talmud starts with the greatest rabbi of the generation and his sons that went out drinking all night. And when they got back, they said, we still haven't recited the Shema. We missed the first third of the night. We missed the first half of the night. We're coming home drunk and bleary-eyed at 4 a.m, and we didn't recite the Shema. And he said, well, listen, the dawn hasn't come up. And remember, my position is until the dawn comes up. So you have to recite it all night. All night. Okay. So just to review one last time, and then I promise we're gonna open it up a little bit. But there's a disagreement over when we say the Shema. Is it the first third of the night? Is it the first half of the night? Or is it all night? And the story is meant to prove that you can do it all night, because Rabban Gamliel said to his very own sons after the first half of the night that they could still do it. Okay. Then there's a question, right? Then there's a question because it turns out that the rabbis agree with Rabban Gamliel. because it's the Mishnah goes on to say it's not only in this case, but anytime you see the rabbis say until midnight, the commandment may actually be performed until the dawn comes up. In other words, the rabbis said until midnight, Rabbi Gamliel said all night, and now we learn that the rabbis, they didn't really mean it. They just want you to do it by midnight. What you can really do it all night long, but they prefer that you do it by midnight. And why do they prefer? And this is a big, like this is the opening statement of the Talmud. This is the punchline here. This is the note they end on. Why did they say to only do it until midnight? In order to keep a person far from sin. Now, what does that mean? What does that mean? There's a difference of opinion. The majority opinion is that you have to complete your Shema by midnight. But Rabbi Gamliel has a kind of a secret teaching, a secret teaching which he told only to his sons. But the truth is, that's the real opinion, is that you can do it all night long. And the only reason that the rabbis shortened the period was to keep you from sin. Now, what does that mean, to keep you from sin? Well, someone explain that? Why does it keep you from sin if I make the time period shorter? Allison?
Is it almost like giving us a curfew? Like maybe the rabbis think that like no good decisions happen after midnight. And so.
Great. Exactly right. That's exactly right. The rabbis are worried. Yeah, you can do it at 4 a.m. But the rabbis are giving us a curfew. Get home by midnight. Because if you come home at 4 a.m, and Allison says this, right? Like, I don't trust your judgment at that point. You're drunk. Imagine this, like the rabbi's sons, the great rabbi of the generation. My sons came home drunk, 4 a.m. They're not going to think about reciting the Shema. It's a bad situation to be in. And so let's make it just go until midnight. And this is a huge insight into what are the rabbis up to? Why do we have this book why did the rabbis come up with all these rules? They seem to be making them up. Well, kind of. They have reasons. Right? We've already said, well, isn't the Shema supposed to be recited at night? But they're on top of their sources, on top of their reasons, they're adding all kinds of limitations that they're just deciding we need because they're worried that if we don't have rules, then what? Then we're not going to do it at all. We're not going to do it at all. And part of what the rabbis see as their job is to create a prayer structure that will keep us in the rhythm of saying our prayers when they suspect that it's human nature that we won't say our prayers, that we simply won't get around to it, and that it's their job to keep us from tripping over the line. Okay. All right. That was all just an introduction. We still have a lot of work to do in the next 20 minutes. So, but that's what are you going to do? That's an introduction to the Talmud. So it's worthwhile in any case. Payam, what do you think of all this? What do you think of all this rule making?
I mean, it's more than that. I think for the rabbis, prayer has almost a magical property to it, in the sense that they say it before you leave your houses. If you're about to commit sin or go to the ale house or do who knows what, if you say this Shema magically, then you realize, oh yeah, I'm an upstanding Jew and I'm going to commit a sin, and therefore I won't commit the sin anymore. So it's almost a reminder of your obligations to mitzvot and what you're supposed to be doing. It's not really a time command thing like that. It's the power of prayer to prevent you from doing stuff.
Great. So the rabbis are very aware of some sense of obligation that the Torah, that's not, they didn't come up with the idea of obligation. The Torah seems to call on us to pray. The Torah seems to call on us to say the Shema, but we don't know when. So how are we going to do this? How are we going to do what the Torah says? The rabbis see themselves as, of necessity, we have to come up with some sort of template here, some sort of map forward. Okay, so let's now see how that mapping goes, okay? Now, we're going to see it with the Shema, and that's easy because Susan's really already done the heavy lifting for us with the Shema. Okay? But this is, remember, I said it's not obvious. When you look at the Shema in the Torah, it's not obvious, oh, that means that I now have to say my Shema whenever the priest would come home from their temple duties, and then I can say it all night, but I really should say it by the end of the first watch, or maybe by midnight. All that stuff that they're saying wasn't obvious at all. So how do they do that work? Well, here's just a snippet, just an illustration of what comes to be our core understanding of how we say our prayers. And this is the one that Susan was knowingly or unknowingly referring to. So this is like one of the first discussions that the later part of the Talmud. When I say the later part, the Mishnah is the first earlier part of the Talmud, and then this is the expansion, what we call the Gemara, the second sort of part of the Talmud. So the Gemara is speaking about the Mishnah, is speaking about that earlier teaching. And it asks, why did the Mishnah begin with the evening Shema? Why do we start? Remember, that's how we started. When do you recite the Shema prayer in the evening? Why do we start with the evening? Why do we start there? Why not begin with the morning Shema? The day begins in the morning. Why did you start in the evening? Well, says the Talmud, the Mishnah bases this on the language of the Torah itself, where it is written, and you shall say these words when you lie down and when you rise. That's what Susan did for us, right? Uv'shachpacha uv'kumecha. This is straightforward. This is as kind of classic Talmudic work as you can get. We, the rabbis, went back. We looked at the verses of the Torah. We saw the order. We scrutinized it carefully, and we are telling you that what the Torah means when it says when you lie down and when you rise is that there's an order to your Shema. There are times for your Shema. And in fact, the evening one is first because that was the language of the Torah. Okay? Now, this is an interesting moment because something else is happening, which is that we are beginning to get what becomes eventually a familiar Jewish structure, which is that our day begins at night, in the eve, right? Our Shabbat begins Friday night and ends Saturday night, not as you might expect that the day begins in the morning, but that the day begins on the eve of. Now, where does that idea come from? Well, that's also a rabbinic reading of verses in the Torah. And here, they're going to give us a different possibility for thinking about why we start in the evening. And the other answer is that they learn the precedence of the evening from the account of the creation of the world. In other words, in the opening lines of the Torah, when God, right after God creates light, it says, "Vayi erev vayi boker yom echad," and there was evening and there was morning one day. Okay. So what just happened is we learned, the rabbis read carefully the language of the Shema and said, oh, uv'shachpacha uv'kumecha. That's the obligation. You have to say once in the evening and once in the morning, and the evening comes before the morning. We think of our prayer cycle as starting in the evening, and we know that from all the way back in Genesis when it said evening and then morning. Now, I just want to pause here for one moment and just ask, like, why is that? Why do the rabbis want to link the Shema, the recitation of the Shema, to the creation of the world? Because here, like, we're getting these rules. Many years later, we'll pick this out and we'll say, oh, just as Susan did, oh, there's the evening and there's the morning, and that's because of the words in the Shema. But the rabbis also made this link to the creation story itself. So why are they structuring why are they reading the Shema, the structure of the Shema, in the same way that they read the structure of the creation of the world? What's going on there? Okay, some answers. Rabbi Barbara Zaki. my sister.
Hi, I just think about that the Holy One spoke everything into being for the creation from day one.
Good.
And so that's why we speak the Shema, or, that's just my take on it.
Great. That's right. There's something the rabbis are suggesting. This is what part of what I want us to see. The rabbis are coming up with little rules, reading text, analyzing things, and then the discussion continues for pages and pages. Years later, we'll see how one turn of phrase turned into our practice. But along the way, you would be missing something if you did not catch that along the way, part of what the rabbis are saying is we should say the Shema in the way that God created the world. That's a big thing to say. We start our days in the evening because we are recreating the world. We are doing as God did. When God said, "Let there be light," when God began God's work of creating, we're going to follow that same function, that same rhythm as we say our prayers, because part of what we're doing when we say our prayers is following God's own pattern. Now that's like a massive thing to say about what function the prayers are serving, kind of to imitate God's work in creating. But they just say it like it just sort of blew by. Oh, here's, by the way, this tradition of evening and morning, we link it to the creation itself. Moving on. It's a massive theological idea that they just tossed out. Moving on. Okay, but that's part of what happens in the Talmud. Okay, so that's a taste of the Talmud. We'll soon now move to the Amidah, but let's hear some more interpretations of what we've seen so far. Hannah Jensen?
I'm thinking about how it addresses relationship. So in creation, we have kind of the first experience of what is our relationship to God. We're created in the image of God or in God's likeness or something like that. And so that's our initial relationship with God, which in some ways we see as being foundationally about love. And then in the Shema, we have the whole point of the Shema is God's love for us, our love for God, which all was established in our initial having been created by God. And so it comes back to just our basic understandings of relationship. And you had asked earlier in the class about why we have the Shema going into the Amidah. And I think it's a similar thing, which is that without the bounds of that relationship, you're not allowed to ask for things. That you have to have some kind of basic connection and understanding of someone, some kind of intimacy before you request things. Before you say, here's what we need, you have to say, I love you and I see you and I understand you and thank you. And we share this intimacy. And because of that, we have this shorthand to be able to ask each other for things. But all of that comes back to creation.
So Hannah's saying a couple of just like massive, just like crucially important things. And she takes us right up to the precipice, right to the point that we will end on tonight, which is to the place of asking, why does the Shema come right before the Amidah? What's happening there? But I want to just hold back. Hannah began to answer that for us, began to think about what it means to be in the Shema and need to be in the Shema before we get to the Amidah. But just to back up, the other massive thing that Hannah said, which is that the Shema is about proclaiming God's oneness. It's about proclaiming our love for God. It's our great declaration of we are connected to God. We acknowledge God. We see God. So when you do that, if you're really trying to celebrate, to tap into, to be in intimate relationship with God, then you follow God's example. Just as God created, so we echo God's creation, right? Just as God started with the evening, so we start in the evening. As we say the Shema, we are affirming God, and we are affirming God in part by imitating God. By echoing God's creation. And that's deliberate, that's intentional. We start our days and we start our prayers the way that God started the day, because part of what our prayers are is a kind of celebration of God and God's wonder and God's power and God's okay. That's a good kind of window into what the Shema is. What is going on in the Shema? what is the content of the Shema that Hannah reminds us of? And then how does that content then inform how the Shema will be performed, how it ought to be performed? What kind of references the rabbis are seeking as they construct the recitation of the Shema, the order of the recitation of the Shema. Okay, I'm coming close to the end of my hour, so we have to read one more thing before we close, which is we haven't gotten to the Amidah yet. And the truth is, we're going to spend next class talking about we're going to really go through the structure of the Amidah. Okay, so never fear. We haven't done a lot of what's actually in the Amidah. We'll do that next time. But I want to get us to that precipice that Hannah pushed us towards. That precipice of understanding this. Now we see that the Shema is said twice a day, according to rabbinic interpretation. That like the way they think of it is that the evening is the first one and then the morning is the other one because of and you can see how they're reading texts and how they're adding other texts to amplify the meaning of the text. But a little later in the Talmud, we return to the question that the Mishnah left off on. This question of what it means that the rabbis want to keep us far away from sin. It's like rabbis really take it upon themselves basically to make rules around rules. To make rules altogether, and then to make rules that aren't even the official rules, but a curfew for us. Now, that idea of rules around the rules, that it famously gets referred to in rabbinic literature as the fence. Okay, making a fence. There's the Torah and its obligations, and the rabbis are here to tell us what the Torah means, whether we understand it or not. And then there's the fence, which is the things that aren't even in the Torah, but the rabbis sort of build around it. Okay, so now, why do they do that? Why is that such a rabbinic? What's going? So one way of thinking about it is they were kind of behavioral psychologists. You know, they felt like, oh, if you go later and later and later, eventually, just like the rhythm of your behavior will eventually lead to you not saying the Shema at all. Or if you eat chicken cheeseburgers, that's another example. Eventually, you just start eating beef cheeseburgers. Like a lot of the rules on top of rules come from a kind of behaviorist perspective, like you can't get too used to something or else you can't get too close to the edge or you'll end up going across. But here they pick up the question again. This is a couple pages later in the Talmud. The rabbis pick up the question again. Well, why was it so important to keep us far away from sin? Remember, the rabbis said you could only say the Shema until midnight, when we know from Rabban Gamliel you can say it all night. So did the rabbis like they just made a curfew for us? They made up a new restriction. So what are they thinking? And the Talmud speaks it out. The rabbis actually hold in accordance with the opinion of Rabban Gamliel. The rabbi's opinion is midnight. Rabban Gamliel is all night. The rabbis admit you can say the Shema all night. We're coming up with this limited time, but that's not true. The truth is you can say it all night. So why do they say until midnight? The fact that they say until midnight is in order to distance a person from transgression. Great, we got that. As it is taught, as the rabbis often teach, the rabbis created a fence for their words, a new restriction in order to prevent the following situation. The following situation. A person comes home from the field in the evening. It's just you and me. We were out at work and we came home from our work in the evening. And they say to themselves, you know what? I'll go home. I'll eat a little. I'll drink a little. I'll sleep a little maybe. And then I'll get up from my nap and I will recite Shema and then I will pray. But then what's going to happen? You know what's going to happen. You've done this. I've done this. Then they're overcome by sleep and end up sleeping through the night. Okay? So there's the logic. They're just speaking it out. In case you missed what it meant to keep a person far from sin, they're just speaking out. It's not so severe. It's just human nature. You know, you're going to come home, you're going to say your evening Shema, but like, first I need to get a little something to eat. First I need, actually a little tired. If I take a nap, I wake up, I'll say the Shema with real intention. And the rabbi's like, no. You need a curfew. You need a bounded time, because if you think you can say it all night, you'll give yourself all night, and then you'll just end up missing the whole thing. Okay? So all of that, and this has been most of our hour, is just understanding how the rabbis got to the strictures around saying Shema in the morning, saying Shema in the evening, and the exact times, and not giving you too much, all of that work. And now we've got a Shema in the evening and a Shema in the morning. And then, and I said this at the beginning of class, just little snippets, little turns of phrase that appear on the Talmud, then get sanctified, get concretized, get recorded in the tradition as official law. And in this case, the one little phrase, which is going to become crucial for the structuring of our prayer, is the phrase, and then I will say the Shema, and then I will pray. Let me just put that on screen again. The person who came home in the evening, first they're going to eat and then drink and then sleep, and then I will recite Shema, and then I will pray. That little example, that little tale of the poor guy who comes home from work in the evening, that becomes the source for what I started out calling the kind of core structure for our prayers, which is that, and here the Talmud is repeating it, the master said, wait a minute now, the master said, recite Shema and then praise. There was an order there. First you recite the Shema and then you recite your prayer, the Amidah. This supports the opinion of Rabbi Yochanan. Well, that reminds the Talmud of another teaching. As Rabbi Yochanan said, who is assured a place in the world to come? Who gets ultimate reward? Who will be rewarded in the world to come? It is one who juxtaposes redemption to the evening prayer. Now, this is the phrase. This is the phrase we've been moving towards all night. Hasomech geula litfilah. The one who juxtaposes redemption to prayer. Now, that's a big phrase here. We're at 7 o'clock. That's the big phrase. So we'll just take a few more minutes to unpack that phrase before we close tonight. Juxtaposing redemption to prayer. Now, we already know when the rabbis say prayer, what do they mean? The Amidah. The Amidah. So then what's redemption? What's redemption? Geula, redemption, salvation, deliverance, God's power. Ariella, do you know what's?
Could that be that as we pray, we are elevated to salvation? Like,
yeah, I think that's right. I think that's one part of these prayers the rabbis see as putting us in contact with the power of God's salvation. And that prayer that the rabbis are referring to now as redemption is the Shema. The Shema. The Shema for the rabbis represented our faith in God's ability to redeem us. And in a very technical way, the rabbis made that clear by writing blessings for the Shema that spoke again and again of God's delivering us from Egypt. But the Shema itself speaks of God's delivering us from Egypt. And the rabbis felt that is what the Shema is doing. The Shema is reminding us of God's power, of God's salvation, of God's mercy, of God's connection to us, of God as the great force in the universe. That's what the Shema does. Now, what did the rabbis want us to do about that? Is to take that redemption and put it up right next to our official prayer, which is the Amidah. Right? The Amidah, which a couple of you have said so far. What takes place in the Amidah? Marvin said this at the outset. We ask for things. We beg God. That's where we started our first class, entreating God, pleading to God for something. So the rabbis, as they kind of sift through the textual material and assign meaning to it, part of what they leave us with is the idea that the Shema represents our belief in God's power. The Amidah calls on that power to do something for us. And so the rabbis thought, this is the way it has to go. We have to say the Shema and then immediately say the Amidah. That's how it should work. That's the movement of our prayers. That's the core of our prayers. First, get in touch with what God is and what God can do, and then beg God to change our world. Okay? So it goes Shema, Amidah. Redemption, prayer. Geula, Tefillah. Shema and Amidah. Okay. Now, we're at the end of our time, but we've gotten somewhere important, which is to say, oh, that's how it works. First, we say the Shema, then we say the Amidah. That will form the core of our prayer. Now, what's the problem with that formula? Does anyone know? Can anyone spot a problem? First, you say the Shema, then you say the Amidah. What's the problem with that formula? There's one big problem.
No mincha.
That's right. There's no mincha.
Only 2 times. It's not 3.
That's right. The problem with that formula is we've been like talking now for a month as a group together. We've been working, we like worked out what is the Amidah, where does it come from? Oh, there's a tradition that we say it 3 times a day. It's a little flimsy where that, okay, we've got it. It's a replacement for the sacrifices. It's a series of requests. We've kind of worked out what that is. Then we spent some time working out what is the Shema? Well, the Shema is a declaration of our faith. It's a declaration of what God is. Is it a prayer at all? Who knows? But you have to recite these words. It says so under. We've got these 2 pieces floating around. Now we just spent a lot of time working out, oh, the Shema gets said twice a day, once in the morning, once in the evening. Now we've got those 2. The Amidah we learned in another class to say 3 times a day. Now we just got told that you put the Shema right before the Amidah. The problem is there's only 2 Shemas and there's 3 Amidahs. So I can now close by just giving us what that comes out to, which is that the core structure of our prayers, this is now, I think on some level, you understand the core content of the evening, morning, and afternoon prayers, and it is as follows. Okay, the basic building blocks was that in the Shema, there's a morning and evening prayer, and in the Amidah, there's a morning, afternoon, and evening prayer. So now, and I'm going to say it in the order that I should probably change this, right? Let's not confuse ourselves by switching around the order that the Talmud gave us. The Talmud gave us the order, which is that the evening is first. The evening prayer is called Mariv, and it begins with a Shema, and then it takes us into an Amidah. Okay, that's the way Mariv works. The morning prayer, Shacharit, same thing. It begins with a Shema, and then it takes us to an Amidah. The afternoon prayer, however, is in the afternoon, and there's no Shema assigned to the afternoon. And so the afternoon prayer is the shortest of the prayers, and it just has an Amidah. There is no Shema. Okay? So everything else that we are going to, all the other prayers that we're going to learn is like, I don't want to say window dressing, but it's add-on. It's add-on. You now have the core structure of each of the 3 core prayers, and that is evening, Shema, Amidah. Morning, Shema, Amidah. Afternoon, just Amidah, because we don't say a Shema in the afternoon. Now, I know that was dense, and there's a lot of like rumbling through difficult text, but we land in a place that may be familiar to some, and if it isn't, it's core Jewish knowledge, which is that the very central structure of our prayers, there are 3 prayers, there are 2 Shmas, we put them together, and what we get is Shema Amidah, and then just Amidah. Where we go from there, well, we'll think about the blessings that we put before and after the Shema. We'll think about what is in the Amidah. We'll think about warm-up prayers like Psukei de Zimra. We'll think about concluding prayers like the Aleinu. But all of those prayers that we will eventually get to are building on this core structure. Again, I ask you to think of it like Shema is the skull, Amidah is the spine, and everything else is just limbs, okay, that we will build onto the prayers. Okay, I apologize. That was a pretty dense class, but I think we got to where we wanted to go. And importantly, we didn't just get there. We didn't just, you say a Shema and then we understand, as the Talmud puts it, that there is a theology behind it. There is a theology there, and it's a theology that Marvin was alluding to, that Hannah was alluding to, and that the Talmud puts in the language of start with redemption. Start with your understanding of what is possible. Remind yourself of what God can do, or what God is, or what you try to have faith in. And then once you've kind of put that in your heart, then turn and say, okay, God, that I have just acknowledged, that I have just tried to remind myself of, that I've just tried to believe in. Okay, if you're out there, I've got some requests for you. And that's sort of the core movement of our prayers. I mean, I'm putting it in kind of like, comic language, but there's a real depth to that. You can't just turn to God and start talking to God and asking for things if you don't have any understanding of like what the hell you're doing in the first place and what is this force? What's possible here? Remind yourself of that first, and then, and only then, can you really be in dialogue with that force. Okay, we'll end there tonight. Thanks, everybody. Sorry for a dense one, but sometimes, you just got to do that.